And we are now operational. And let's get the magic little clickety, 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 clack, clack, clack opening, of which we have absolutely no music. Troubles in Paradise. Telephone exchanges. Remember dial telephones. Remember typewriters. Remember clocks that were analog. Whee! And there's Peter's wonderful logo that I got, Troubles in Paradise. Everybody take note of my website. If you don't have it on your website thing, on your browsers, why the hell not? And so here we got our stop sharing mode, and we are now into the exciting world of my latest episode. Cap's here to act as a comic foil for the old RJ. And we got a packed show today because not only...
RJ?
Oh, yeah?
I was going to ask, since you say I'm a comic foil, why didn't you tell me beforehand? I would have grabbed my tinfoil hat.
Yeah, well, there you go. You'll be insulated against Clyodon waves. We got Brian and Old Scratch in there, and we'll see how else. You can also, Cap, you can be a favor to kind of keep an eye on the live chat to see what's going on in there. And if anybody comes up with some interesting questions or like what the hell's going on remarks, let me know on it, because I look over there occasionally, but I can get involved with what I'm saying ideally. And so I may not pay close enough attention to it. So will you do that for me, young chap? And you are muted. Okay.
Yeah, I was sorry. I was muted because I was pulling the video. I was getting the pop-out chat, and I didn't want it to somehow...
Oh, yeah. If you didn't have that, I would give that to you. But anyway, yeah, keep an eye on that. So anyway, we've got a couple things going on. We're going to be continuing the analysis of Rupe and Sanford's Contested Bones book, which I will hold up for everyone to see. Isn't that exciting? It's all book-like, isn't it? There's a creationist book, and it's a piece of crap from the scholarly methods point of view, which I've been analyzing now for quite a few weeks. And then there'll also be a discussion a little bit later about Gunther Bechly's latest diatribe at Evolution News and Views. But an interesting bit is that I've been having an exchange over the last week with a young Earth creationist who was taking issue with the first of this series. And he's not apparently seen any of the other ones, but he was complaining that, oh, I was being hard and bad in my accusations against these poor creationists. And he got so incensed with it, he's actually bought their book. Well, goody gumdrops. He's got another book sale. Isn't that wonderful? But what was fascinating about the kid is you couldn't get him kicking or screaming to talk about the examples I was talking about. Remember, you've seen, I put links up to the actual technical papers so people can fall up on this stuff on their own. So they don't have to take my word for it. And instead, he was just obsessing particularly on polystrate fossils. He just really wants polystrate fossils to be real. And so I said, okay, you got some sources for that? And naturally, he popped up a bunch of creationist sources. And so I looked through them. One from Henry Morris is an old one from the 1990s that had no technical citations in it. So how would you go about fact-checking that? And so what I was trying to get this kid to do is get off his plinth and try to source analyze his own material. And nope. He just doesn't do that.
Did he link AIG? Because usually whenever I...
Oh, it was a bunch of stuff. There was an AIG post. There was one from ICR. And a lot of it was old. Only one of them, in fact, one from Apologetics Press. And if you go back to the very first video in the series, the one where I introduced the thing, you'll find the links all to it. So I didn't put them in this because I had a ton of links to put in anyway and didn't want to go overboard on it. But if you follow up on all of those links, you find out that only the Apologetics Press one even had any technical sources, and they were both old stuff from the 1970s. So it was pretty threadbare. His argument was it bothers him, the idea that some of these polystrate trees are formed from pyroclastic flows. When in the case of the ones in Yellowstone, like duh, and then there's this Joggins Cliff deposit that's not formed in a pyroclastic flow, but it's formed from slightly different things, but it's still all perfectly natural. And there's a large technical literature on this subject, which I couldn't get him kicking and screaming to pay any attention to. Yeah. I offered to have a discussion with him on the show if he wanted. And so if C. Brown shows up in the live chat, maybe that's in. Oh, Lord Quacka Squirrel has joined us. Yes.
Hey, Squirrel, you're not Ren Bailey today.
No, I'm not.
Yes. You're actually coming in as Quacka Squirrel.
I checked it beforehand.
That's good. Yes, because it's thrown us off the other times when you come in with a different avatar. Anyway, I'll be starting off with resuming my discussion of Rupe and Sanford, where it's often slow going with them because they're making ultimately occasionally actual technical points. And at the moment, I'm in their Homo erectus chapter, where their big upshot is that Homo erectus are just human beings, that they're not separate from human beings. They're perfectly normal human beings. And they go through an authority quote and selectively quote a bunch of different sources to reinforce that. Well, this time they actually bumped into some information. And I put a link up to a book they cited where page 61 was the relevant page. And if you go to Amazon, you look up their preview and actually locate that. And you can check the references in the end. That's also open access. So I was able to actually see the area that they were riffing off of. And boy, are they leaving stuff out.
Of course they are.
And,
yeah.
That's their job. Didn't you know that?
Yeah.
What I told you that.
In Rupe's case, definitely, because he was the point man for Rupe and Sanford. Sanford acknowledges in his own introduction that Rupe basically did all the legwork. And that in this case,
now he's going to wish he hadn't let Rupe do all the shit, or Sanford do it all.
Yeah. Well, there you go. And the Rupe is not doing well as a technical scholar. And anyway, what he did, there's a whole bunch. If you look up the excerpt on page 61, you'll see that they discuss a lot of different things that are different from human beings. That yes, the physical anatomy from the neck down is very similar, but not identical. And that there was evidence that there was a different growth rate pattern in the bones. There was a different growth rate pattern in tooth eruption systems that's significantly different from what we find in human beings. And so there were a lot of different anatomical details that show that, yes, Homo erectus is almost on the human boundary. Well, duh, because that's the species from which our species developed. Yeah. So, duh, we got to be practically there, but not quite. And what was particularly ironic is that the material that they were alluding to was specifically mentioning information in detail that, are they going to talk about it? Well, it turns out Rupe mentions one bit, which has to do with the fact that the thing that holds the spinal column and the nerves is much smaller in Homo erectus than in humans. And it was suggested that this was connecting with breathing and also neural systems that suggested their language capabilities and other things, to the extent that breathing relates to the ability to talk, is less sophisticated than what we find in human beings and outside the range of human beings. And there was a particular paper, the Lernin paper, that I put a link to, so you can go and read the whole thing. Now, they, on the next page of the book, decided to attack this argument, this one snippet. There's actually more arguments about tooth eruption patterns that they never brought up. But they do challenge this thing about the foramen opening of where this relates to the breathing issue. And they obviously don't like that. That's making humans sound too different from Homo erectus for their taste. So they decide to respond to it. And who did they get for it? A creationist. And it's this, it's this Indian creationist, Vij Sardana, who, although his book is out, it's not accessible. You can't get a preview of it on Amazon, so I didn't put a link to it. But I did do a little background because I hadn't heard of this clown before. And there was an interview with him at Creation magazine where he talks about this particular bird fossil, a dinosaur, feathered dinosaur fossil that had been analyzed. And I knew about this case. It's the Rubin work from 1999, and he was riffing off of this information way secondhand. It turned out all the notes, I put the linkage up to it. If you look in the notes of where they are citing, those are all the secondary sources that don't discuss this fossil either. So where is he getting his stuff? No mention of the Rubin paper. I happen to know about what he was referring to because I know what the example was. The thing was that Rubin and company, John Rubin back in 1999, had thought they had identified some soft tissue issues in this particular fossil. And they were arguing that the dinosaur had more of a crocodilian breathing mechanism than bird-like. And of course, the creationists have been riffing off of it ever since. The problem was Rubin and company were wrong. And in the years since, they've been criticized at the time. And I have a link to a technical paper in 2011 that's one of the most recent analysis of the subject. And basically what they had misinterpreted was actually just a preservation smudge, and it wasn't actually real. And so bye-bye on that argument. So as a predictor of scientific data, Sardana has, shall we say, some limitations, and therefore he's a bad one to rely on as the sole authority for challenging this. And I could not find this bit about the breathing issue. I couldn't find any technical arguments in the 20 years since that have ever taken issue with it. It's apparently just a perfectly accepted analysis. And so, yeah, they're grasping at straws here. So anyway, you wanted to make a comment there, Krakow?
Yeah, when are they not grasping at straws? You have to have straws on hand if you're going to build a freaking straw man.
Yeah. Well, that's quite true. What involved my general spreadsheet analysis, because remember, the book didn't have a bibliography, and so I'm constructing one so that I can see how many sources they actually have and where they're cited and all the rest. And then I'm also having a spreadsheet analysis. In some of the earlier shows, I've actually put that up so people can kind of see what I'm doing on it. And the numbers, yeah.
I have a really dumb question. Why on earth would you expect anybody to take your technical / scientific work seriously of any description if you don't include a bibliography? I thought that was like a requirement or something.
Yeah. You find this weird lapse in a lot of stuff. Jonathan Wells, his books often didn't have a bibliography. They had references. Michael Denton's new book didn't have a bibliography. He's got piles of references, but there's no reference bibliography. And what it means is it's hard to tell what's in it at a glance, because you've got to manually, if you want to say, well, does he mention so-and-so's work? How would you know if you don't have a damn reference bibliography to see if it's been cited? And so and so you got to plow through what I'm doing, source by source by source. So what I've come up is, so far they're falling into a fairly rote pattern of where about 60% of their citations are for authority quotes, and about 60% of their citations are secondary sources. And of the technical work, if it's not just generic material, when they actually are trying to use it for apologetic purposes, 20% of that stuff is just wrong. They're misinterpreting the original paper. So it's not looking too good on there. Oh, I see. Yes, Gonna Go For It's in, and BJ. So we got a nice group of people. Hi, gang. And we got people monitoring the live feed there. So if I miss something on questions, let me know so I can jump in and deal with them. So the upshot is that our gang at Rupe and Sanford Contested Bones are following in the same footsteps. That when they're trying to make a case for human beings and Homo erectus and Neanderthals all just being one little happy family, they're having to suppress data right and left in their own cited sources. And that's why, so that I put the links up so you can see that primary source information for yourself, and you can look to see how well they're dealing with it. Now, the other show element that I'm putting up today relates to over in Intelligent Design Land. Gunther Bechly, the paleontologist who apparently got religion and became a Roman Catholic a ways ago, and so he's jumped on the intelligent design bandwagon, and he's their one and only paleontologist that they have to work with. And he's been starting to post now at Evolution News and Views, and I mentioned some of his stuff earlier. One of the things that's really fascinating about Beckley, that is part of the pattern of all anti-evolutionists, is I don't know what he thinks happened. We know what he doesn't want to have happen. Oh, Darwinism. We don't want that Darwinism happening. But what do you think happened? Has there been any natural branching common descent at all? How many design events are there? What does a design event look like? What's the implications of this? How many designers are there? All of that stuff that would be if they really took their own model seriously, you ain't getting. So this latest installment, I came upon because I followed Denise O'Leary, the annoying Canadian intelligent design advocate, and she made a link to one of probably her posting, but she does it anonymously at Uncommon Descent. And it then linked to Beckley's post at Evolution News and Views. I didn't put Denise O'Leary's one in, but I did put the primary one from Beckley. And Beckley's hobby horse is they found a fossil monitor lizard that's got 4 eyes, by which it means it's got the 2 normal eyes, and it's got well-developed pineal gland sensory systems up on the top, which is not uncommon in a lot of reptiles and lizards. And
no, last I heard, they were when we became mammals, we lost those.
Thereby hangs a tale that it's way even more interesting than that. And what it is that Beckley's contention is that the pineal sensory system has appeared and disappeared repeatedly in the fossil history, and therefore it's a complete mess. And so he's jumping beyond the usual arguments of somebody like Cornelius Hunter, who is always complaining about convergence, that if you have differing lineages that have developed very similar systems through convergence, oh, no, it's common design, damn it. Well, Beckley's ratcheted it up to a new level of dumb, which is that systems that have inherited by common descent that eventually become deactivated because they're no longer used, that can't happen all at once in different systems. And that's somehow that you can't have deactivations occurring in disparate lineages, that's somehow anti-Darwinian and inexplicable.
I have one thing to say on that, as far as like, so this is an idea that we have from a design standpoint. If you don't need it, don't use it. So anything that would become deactivated but we still have, guess what? That completely discredits any and all design claim anyone makes, because no designer would be that incompetent in their work.
Yeah, well, that would involve Beckley having to think through what he thinks happened. And so in the posting, not only do you not get what he thinks happens, but he really pushes himself out onto a limb, because he cited a whole slew of technical papers. And I have made a point of putting the links into them because I want you to read them too. Because
I have a question.
Yeah, jump in.
Since when the hell did Beckley think?
Oh, well, Beckley is an interesting example. Remember, Beckley is an actual trained paleontologist. He is a published paleontologist. He's had species named after him. He's in insect systematics. He's had a long and perfectly fine career as in writing technical papers, and I've got quite a few of them in my bibliography now. But they're all very green eye shade, detailed systematic stuff. He's never written any works on the general evolution of life issues or general evolution of insect issues. He's just systematizing this particular species of dragonfly in this particular family. And it doesn't sound like he's opposed to common descent, but he doesn't seem to be mentioning common descent. And what his ideas of it are in his postings as an intelligent designer. It's all pot shots against the Darwinist model that he kind of superficially characterizes. Now, the reason why that mammal issue is interesting, and also crocodiles as well as reptiles, is when you read those various papers that he linked to, and therefore it fell under his eyeballs, presumably, all of that information. What's clear about the fact is that this pineal gland network that also has sensory systems is deep in the reptilian groups. And it was always running amok in the basal tetrapods and in the basal amniotes, from which the diapsids and synapsids and groups eventually develop. And then it starts fading out in some, but not all. And you still find reptiles today that have got this thing fairly active, and this fossil from 50 million years ago that beefed it up even more with a much more developed sensory system that unlike what you typically find. And this is the thing that Beckley's riffing off of. But what's intriguing about the Therapsid paper is it goes into great detail as to how often in the basal group of the synapsids that this system was still active and only began to fade out in the Therapsids, and very interestingly where they're fading out. And this brings up the nocturnal hypothesis, that what happens is that organisms that have to live in the dark, that hunt in the dark, hunkered down because the dinosaurs dominate the day or whatever, or living in murky environments where they're in water environments that have limited vision, and so they've got to have really good vision, eyeball vision. Those little pineal vision sensors are really weak, and they get shunted aside as irrelevant and deactivated, even though the deep genetic systems is involved. What's particularly hilarious about the Therapsid paper is that they were able to identify the specific gene that mutated, that deactivated this system in Therapsids.
Actually, believe it or not, we still have that gene completely deactivated. We don't.
Yeah, the elements in the deep developmental biology, it's still lurking around in there. So here was the problem that Beckley was tap dancing around at 900 miles an hour. It's what are the odds that a lineage once in a while might not merely reactivate the system, but actually hone it, because it lives in an environment where that nocturnal factor isn't all that important. By the way, the crocodiles, another couple of the papers are relating to crocodiles. And there too, the crocodiles had undergone the same dynamic independently, convergently, that we could see happening over in the Therapsid line. And the crocodiles are even a more interesting example. And I pointed this out several times in my tip work, and I think I got a little bit of a section on it in Evolution Slam Dunk. And I mentioned it, I think, in one of my evolution hours, is that the crocodiles did more than just minimizing the pineal gland system. Their hearts are much more complicated than normal reptiles. And there's every reason to think that the ancient crocodiles of the Mesozoic were functionally warm-blooded and really active. They were long-legged sprinters. There were fully aquatic models. And what we're seeing now is the very trimmed-down remnant of a much more diverse lineage, where they've got the fossil forms of this once much more active metabolism that's been able to operate more efficiently in the particular crocodiles, that they don't have to worry about all this other stuff, because they've developed a very nice low-key model that can be functionally endothermic again, and they're a little niche lineage. So you can trace all of these little components that go on. Well, one thing that really fascinated me with this is that there was all this information that didn't filter through. Just compare reading Beckley's version with the technical papers to see all that he's leaving out, and then find where he doesn't discuss what he thinks happened. Why doesn't he think through this design argument of his and explain why these lineages are their lineages? He needs to decide, does he accept speciation? Yeah.
I was going to say, the reason he doesn't think through his design argument is because if he actually did, he would realize just how dumb it actually is. And he's, from the way you kind of described it, he's more or less doubled down on everything. So if he were to go, oh, wow, I was wrong, it would make him look almost completely discredited within the creationist field and all the other fields.
Yeah. Honestly, Peter, if he didn't pull the Tortugan thing, when working through this shit, you'd probably never see him.
Yeah.
He's never. Yeah, I don't expect him ever to think through what he thinks happened. Michael Denton is a perfectly fine cross measurement here, and he has no religious motivation. He's an agnostic, so it gives a measure to see the naked methodology independent of any religion component. But Denton has had 30 years to figure out what the hell he thinks happens with any of this stuff, and he still hasn't worked it out. He has no idea what he thinks happened. His brain just shuts down on this point. Now, by the way, I'm going to have a bone to pick with you, Cap, because Peter over in the live chat was saying you claim no designer would use unnecessary material. That's demonstrably incorrect. I am more on your side on this, Cap. What I would have a caveat is that no rational designer would use that. A designer does not deliberately put in stuff that is a bad idea.
A competent designer. That's why I was
they can easily make decisions based upon what they have at the moment that turn out to be a bad idea in the long term. The Titanic is an excellent example of that. It is a perfectly well-designed ship that, as we all know, ended up not working out well. And it wasn't because there was any intentional will to badly design, but it was also not what an omnipotent designer would do, where the omnipotent designer would know all these pitfalls in advance and make a point of it.
Yeah, and that's why I was talking with him. I was like, yeah, I'll word it better next time, because a competent designer, and that would do it, like with us having tails, like when we get the
Peter says, look, play your intro, look at all the unnecessary stuff in it. That is art, sir, not design.
Yeah.
So we're now using design in a different context.
It's like us having tails, which are completely useless.
Art and functionality.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the important lesson, and this is a really critical lesson that, boy, every anti-evolutionist fails to grasp, is what it means to have innovation within a lineage. That by definition, since everything is related by natural branching, common descent, all an organism has to work with is the natural mutations building on what they inherited along their lineage. So it can be the best idea in the world that's going on in the organism next door, but you can't replicate that unless you've got the substrates that occur naturally to do so. Now, what the fun part is about convergence, and the thing that Beckley is trying to use as an argument against evolution, and Cornelius Hunter and various others have tried that as well, is to argue that nature cannot produce similar outcomes at various levels, even if they're on a different lineage. But there are hydrodynamic limits. The classic example is a tuna and a shark and a dolphin and an ichthyosaur. All have very similar hydrodynamic shapes. Why? Because they're moving through water. And it's a very viscous medium that if they don't get shaped like that, they're not going to swim well. Blocks of wood, boxes, make really bad, fast swimmers. And so you're not going to, there's a way that it's going to end up looking that way, even though the moment you look at the rest of the organism, it's going to betray the fact that one is a cartilage shark in anatomy, another one is a bony fish, another one is a reptile, and another one is a mammal. And so at that detail level, you can see that underneath the surface convergent detail, you've got underlying things that reflect their separate lineage. Now, the other thing comes when you're looking at convergences at the deep molecular level. And this pineal thing is falling into that category, that you have a deep substrate that have occurred in a lot of different lineages, and it gets selected for or minimized or not, that the cell structures are still present, but they don't get activated. But all it takes is a mutation, and probably mutations are occurring all the time that in the right selective environment will be built on. Otherwise, they get weeded out again. And as Beckley, what intrigued me about Beckley is he's not a young earth creationist. At no point did it occur to him, let's put all of these little examples in chronological order. He only viewed them as a series of systematic categories, not as something that's occurring 50 million years ago, or 150 million years ago, or 200 million years ago. And what happened between them? Well, that's a lot of millions of years. Fill in what you think happened. Tell us what your model tells you what would have happened. He doesn't have a model, so he can't deal with that kind of stuff.
Why would he have a model? He barely has a coherent idea at this point.
And what's fascinating about this is that,
he does have one. God.
Well, but it's not quite that simplistic, because here he isn't mentioning God at any point. But the problem is he isn't mentioning design either, other than just as a placeholder. And so ultimately, Beckley is reflective of the fact that his argument ultimately is a God of the gaps. Evolution can't explain X, therefore not X, which is wink, wink, nudge, nudge, the design, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, the God of the Catholic Church.
They can wink, wink, nudge, nudge all they want. If they don't have a clear idea of what it is, they need to figure that part out before they make any statements.
Okay,
that would be nice.
That's rare, because I've never really seen an idea argue ID without arguing God. I mean, the
ID arguments, they're always in the back seat, and it depends on the venue. It's no coincidence that the vast majority of intelligent design presentations from the Discovery Institute are at churches, not colleges. And so this is their audience. And there, the wink, wink, nudge, nudge turns into something rather more overt. And I've been to that one that Casey Luskin had over in Seattle a few years back. And so I know this directly. But the thing is that there is no there in anti-evolutionism. That map of time, what do you think happened? No anti-evolutionist, I mean this literally, No anti-evolutionist has worked out what their model is. Even they have a generic model, but nothing specific.
Unfortunately, that's what they're going to need if they're going to upset evolution.
Yeah.
And they need to be able to, and they need to be able to explain all the extant data, and then explain yet more, and make predictions.
And all of that they're never going to be able to do. They haven't been able to do this 100 years. And so what's fun in a horrific sort of way, air quotes fun, is watching somebody like Beckley, who is a regular tenured academic scientist with a published track record as a systematist with insects, suddenly reveal the there that isn't there. And when you start looking at his background on things, that he can't apply any of his skill set in detail to construct what he thinks happened. There is no competing model there. It's just a negative argument. And so we're going to be seeing whether or not he ever gets around to it. I wasn't the only one that spotted this. There was one of his critics on one of his earlier pieces that explicitly says, where's your model? What do you think happened with it? I don't know what Beckley thinks for speciation, whether or not he thinks speciation doesn't happen at all, or if he does, where the limits of it are, and how much dynamic variables are going on in terms of his insect field, let alone primates, let alone reptiles and mammals and all the other little fields that he's now bumping into. What he reminded me of horrifically and hilariously was John Woodmarapp. John Woodmarapp, for those of you the creationists that I rake over the coals in Slam Dunk, in particular, on his argument. He's using, ironically, about the same kind of argument that Beckley is using.
If I may, there is one I heard about, and I don't remember exactly where. But to put this all together, you would need not one but two strands of DNA to make the creationist/ID argument even work. Especially when you're talking about the baraminologists, you would have to have one that is unalterable, absolutely will not change, and then you have to have a second strand in which mutations can occur, so that you get changes within species, but not one quote unquote kind to the next.
Well, I don't think in principle you would need to have quite that structure of DNA, even within the kind framework. What their model is, to the extent that they think
somebody made at me, and all I could do.
Well, then they're a complete fool, and they're making it up as they go along, because there's not even baraminologists have made that kind of an argument, and from a biological point of view, even within their creationist framework, wouldn't make any sense. Their argument would be that you would have the created kind that can proliferate within its kind. So there's a set parameter of to how far it can vary and no farther, and that kinds cannot interbreed and kinds cannot fission off new kinds. And that would be theoretically plausible within a genetic framework that has DNA replicating and ribosomes and all the rest. But the problem comes is that model falls apart the moment you look at the data, because they can't identify, unless they're very narrowly framed, of trying to find ones where you don't have the intermediate components easily done. So animals that have ventured off a long time ago and have a relatively small population of groups today, they might find things that they can theoretically peg in there. But the test case involves us. More often than not, baraminologists decide, and they have to, in order to keep the booking plan for a Noah's Ark down to a manageable level, they've got to functionally have kinds to be families at the systematic level. That's they go veer too much away from that. They have too many things to put on the ark. And even the listing at AIG's ARC thing, which I was able to do a little spreadsheet analysis on, they came up with like a little under 1,500 kinds on board, and the total number of animals it calculated, I can't remember, it was like 8,000 or something like that, because some of them are 14 per kind and some of them are only 2 per kind, depending on whether they're clean or unclean. But anyway, that family level argument starts breaking down, must break down, the moment they deal with us. That they can't use the same standard that they apply to trilobites and anomalocarids and wildebeests to human beings, because human beings have to be their own specially created kind, no negotiations, no variations. So now you get back to connect up with Rupe and Sanford. they've got a taxonomical hair-splitting problem, because they have to deal with that spectrum from Australopithecines through Homo habilis to Homo erectus to us and Neanderthals, that it's a spectrum of variation where individually group A spills over into group B, and there's the almosts and so forth, which is why the Turkana boy may be regarded as Homo ergaster, according to some, or just as a subspecies of Homo erectus, because their transitional nodes are difficult to grade precisely because they're intermediates. But if you look at the whole node, you start seeing this group here is very different as an average than human beings are. That's the case with Homo erectus. When you start looking at the range of things there, the structure of the bones and other things, they're almost human in a lot of ways, and Rupe will cherry pick the parts that fit all on that.
Well, no,
but
they are human after their own fashion. They're just a more primitive version.
They're almost our species. Their brains are much smaller.
You keep referring to human beings, but you got to realize a lot of these things are actually human to some degree, or
that's
very
the exact
much like
same.
Homo sapiens to a large degree.
That's the same nomenclatural issue that we get into, that they are exploiting that ambiguity. And the problem is that the grade into Homo erectus, and then Homo erectus back millions of years, and then Homo erectus into Australopithecines, you have a series of overlaps, but there's no way in hell that a creationist will allow an Australopithecine onto the human frame unless you're Todd Wood, because Australopithecus sediba managed to get lumped into the human holobaramin, according to one of his analyses. But of course, Wood is a data splitter to where he parses the data fields down. But even there, he managed to have something that violated their own grassroots notions that Australopithecines are just apes and everybody else is actually just mutant humans. The problem is they cannot allow a transitional form to exist at all. So they can't define what they would accept as one. That's the other 100% failure rate.
See,
RJ,
yeah,
go ahead.
We actually have a species. We actually have a species split as we are now. We have our favorite Homo sapiens sapiens, and then we have H. creatartus, which represents most of the people we talk about. And then H. stupidicus is just another critter over off to the right-hand side.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, even baraminology will not be able to make sense of those. But nevertheless, the thing is that the thing that strikes me, and it's not just with human evolution, it's everyone, that when you start looking at major transition nodes in the history of life, where you end up coming out of it with something that's significantly different from where it started out, is you've got these little nodes where you get the almosts. And you find this in the Mammaliaformes and the Crocodiliaformes and the Dinosauriformes, the ones that are the almosts. And I mentioned this in last week's episode regarding Cornelius Hunter riffing off of dinosaurs, to where he just was too far away from the data field. And Rupe and Sanford are representing exactly that same problem, is that they're aware of snippets of the data, but they don't have a model to work with, where they would lay out a set of criterion that if this were true, they would accept it as a transitional. And never will you find that.
Well, you've got the other. I had a thought running around in my little brain, and now I've lost it. Sorry about that. Carry on. I'll remember it again.
Brain fart alert.
If I don't remember it today, I will remember it. I will write it down.
So, systematics is one of the giant blind spots of all anti-evolutionism, which is anything related to anything, and if so, what are the limits of it? And ultimately, from an evolutionary point of view, everything is one gigantic baramin. All life is related by natural branching, common descent.
I remember now.
Yeah. Okay. Jump in.
Sorry about that. Don't mean to cut you off mid-sentence there.
Oh no, that's fine.
If they were going to try and work their magic, they'd have a lot more. They'd have it a lot easier if they didn't. If instead of humans, they went for crocodilians, the crocodiles and the alligators, because you really only have a couple species of each.
Now
they'd be able to match.
No,
they'd be able to match those up a whole lot faster.
And there's the problem, is that they also have to deal with the fossils. And
Yeah,
there have
well,
been, I think, a couple baraminology stabs at crocodiles. But the problem is the fossil record of crocodiles is very diverse. And what we see in the modern form is just a tiny little snippet. I think I mentioned it in either tip 1.4 or 1.2, one of them. I think 1.4, I think, on Darwin, where I go into an intelligent design guy that was taking a pot shot at crocodiles being living fossils. And I pointed out, no, they're way more diverse than that. So yeah, there's no baraminologist that's going to be able to ferret their way through even the crocodiles in that group. And they're growing ever more diverse and detailed, and the technical literature is ever more diverse and detailed. And this main point about how the crocodiles have hunkered down over time, and the modern versions are much less diverse in their metabolism and a lot of their genetic developments, and also this nocturnal factor of why the crocodilians have lost their pineal visual system. And there's one of the technical papers that I put a link in on that Beckley knew about, that he cited all on that. And there's an additional paper by Wada in there as well that Emmerling had alluded to, which was on the undercurrent system and the genetics and biology of the pineal gland system. It should be pointed out that it was noted that at the molecular level, not a lot is yet known about how any of that stuff works. And so there's a whole big field of research that will liable to be done in the next few decades. And I'll bet you $9 to a hole in a donut, Beckley is not going to be doing any of that work, and no anti-evolutionist will be doing any of that work.
Nope.
Now, we're well past the thing I'm going to put in my shameless plug here. So let me do a little screen share.
And RJ, I'll just say this. I'm not going to take that bet. You see, I don't take sucker bets.
Yeah, I know. I mean, like a sucker bet here. Well, it's kind of like Kent Hovind and his stupid thing, for any proof of evolution. Anyway, here are my patrons: Stephen and Dyer and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Daniel and Ralph and Eric and Benjamin and Staggles and Alex and Totas Real and Everett and Paul. Thank you all, and remember to behold and partake of my tip project at tortugan.wordpress.com. Put it on your little tabs. Eventually, I'm probably going to have to tinker with the website to make it more iPhone friendly, because little small snippets and things, but I'm still not entirely certain of that. I got to get used to my own smartphone to get an idea of how I want to modify it. There's the Patreon for the videos, but much more important, because money gets to me way faster, by GoFundMe.com DCGo. The old RJ is a Social Security person, and I'm getting a little bit of book royalties and the like, but there's also the GoFundMes, and it's very, very much appreciated. You can read the links to Nick Matsky, who supported the project, telling why it's important to do this, and also all the stuff at tortuganwordpress.com. You'll find links to my books, you'll find links to this channel, you'll find links to my various debates and other kinds of things. So there's a lot of stuff there. All the PDFs there are open access. Please share them, make use of them, download them, read them, and purvey of the information, because it can't do a damn bit of good if you don't pay attention to it and use it. So I'm trying to put this in mode. I'll say another thing as I shut down the screen sharing here, that what I'm doing in the TIP project is something totally new that no one has done before. And that is, I sort of stumbled into it, but now that I'm doing it at length, in that I am, in addition to the apologetic stuff where I'm criticizing creationists and I'm building up arguments to where I can see what holes need to be filled. That's why I wrote Slam Dunk, because I could see the reptile mammal transition hadn't been covered properly. Now it is. That I'm measuring literally how much source citation anti-evolutionists have been using. So as I'm doing this Rupe and Sanford thing, all of the citations that they have, I'm incorporating into my data field. So I can tell you, as a matter of direct measurement, that out of over 2,300 anti-evolutionists who have generated over 8,600 sources, 95% of them do not cite primary sources at all. And of the 5% who do, only a third of them, only about 50 people, are actual fact claimants. And they have cited only a few thousand, 3,000 or so technical sources altogether. And that is barely 10% of the working data field. None of this is guesstimating. I'm measuring it. And so what I will be continuing to do with the project is continuing to plow through incoming technical arguments being made by intelligent designers and young Earth creationists and the rare old Earth creationists. They're basically moribund now. And plowing through the masses of data that I have in my fire hazard stacks in the basement of older creationist material, although an awful lot of that will be very repetitive to where they're not actually adding much technical citation. They'll be repeating the stuff earlier, the stuff that later is repeated by other creationists. But gradually, this will be like an asymptote, where over the next years and decades, I will have a full comprehensive measurement of this. And in principle, someday, I'm going to have to like train people to continue this project, because I don't want it to stop with me. It should stop with me. This should be just the first stage in a large scale element that acts as a defensive line and an investigative line to measure and improve our apologetics. I've tried to show that the way to deflate anti-evolutionists is a multi-level analysis, and it starts with source methods, how they construct their argument. It includes the data floor to where you know the data field, and your research of the data field will improve your understanding of the issues, will make you more confident in dealing with creationists, will be able to know what anvils to drop on them and to what trapdoors to open, much better than you would have before. And then when they try to go way upstream to philosophy and talk about metaphysical naturalism and all that stuff, that you'll have diffused a lot of their arguments along the way, and that kind of philosophical dissembling will be seen much more obviously as such. Now, you're never going to persuade the diehard creationists. I started out the program talking with Cap about the little creationist who was haunting the first of this series. He apparently has not bothered to see any of the others since, and this is like 10, 15 of them that I've done so far, week after week, analyzing the book, plowing through it. He is a young earth creationist just addicted to wanting to talk about polystrate fossils, polystrate trees. What he doesn't want to discuss is what I was bringing up in the video, which is that there's an objectively bad method of Rupe and Sanford in their book, that they misrepresent sources, that they're superficial, they're authority quoting. All of those sins are put in. And every single episode, I have explicitly linked to technical papers so that you can check out the stuff for yourself. And it's revealing that that little schnook can't engage on that level. No creationist can. If they could, they would have been familiar with the arguments. They wouldn't have the positions they do because they couldn't defend them. That's my point. Comments? Feedback from the peanut gallery here?
No. I'm pretty sure you've got a couple of volunteers right here in the hangout for that training thing. And then I've already started working on a similar project myself, mostly to do with cosmology.
Yeah.
It'll be a while before I can even.
It's a no-lose situation for us. Source methods is not as hard to do as it was before. I could easily say that somebody, if they were coming at this in 1990, they would be in a much harder spot. Even if they were coming into it in 2005, they would be in a much harder spot because a lot of the source material wasn't accessible. Computers were slower. Storage media were slower and less versatile. But now, good gravy, we got portable computers that we can carry around in our hands. And we have instantaneous access to easily 80 to 90% of the primary source technical literature is accessible somewhere, open access. So it's not a matter of money. I can tell you, as somebody without a lot of money, I depend on that. And so the ability that I don't have to go through a firewall and pony up 10 or 20 bucks to be able to read some article is really important for the analysis. So there's plenty of primary source material available. And the study of that primary source material puts you knee-deep in the direct research, not secondary analysis like a Richard Dawkins summary book, as useful and interesting as those may be. You're becoming structured into the terminology and methodology of the scientists on their own turf. And so you will notice by the contrast between what Beckley, who is a trained paleontologist, but he suddenly is really lightweight when he's doing his apologetics now. And you'll find that is a standard thing, that even with people with technical backgrounds who have PhDs under their belt, they suddenly start turning to mush when they get into this anti-evolution gig. Comments?
I don't know. I've currently been ripping through Kent Hovind and his pile of crap.
Oh God.
Yeah, well, Kent Hovind, let me put you into the perspective of where Kent Hovind falls on the spectrum of analysis. He is a secondary redactor. He is not a fact claimant. So of those 50 people that I pointed out, the ones that actually make the source claims, Kent isn't one of them. He's never been one of them. Kent is a copyist. He copies older creationist material, and some of the stuff is newer material, but it's online stuff. And he's riffed off of Karl Baugh and the people that push the Paluxy River tracks. It's all a network of lower echelon grassroots creationism, and he's popular only in lower echelon grassroots creationists. Regular higher level creationists like at Answers in Genesis don't give him the time of day. They don't cite him. They don't quote him. They criticize him. Literally. Answers in Genesis has written several pieces that say, no, you're not very good. Don't we go away. And so you've got this branch. Seriously. Yes. Yeah.
You know why I'm tearing apart Kent? Because Kent is that actually tertiary redactor, and I can go back and start looking up the chain to figure out where he's getting some of these bullshit.
Yeah. And it's a fun chain to do. And there's another reason for going, I'll interrupt you, Cap, for this. There's another reason for going after Kent Hovind, is that Kent Hovind has millions of followers. He is actively influential. I bump into Kent Hovindistas way more than I have bumped into somebody who has read a Michael Behe book. And there are Kent Hovind people who are serving in state legislatures, and Tony Perkins comes from an environment where he's been feeding off of Kent Hovind as well as Ken Ham.
Yeah. I was just going to say, is it wrong that I still find it absolutely comical when you get the infighting between the two groups, and it's just like, what do we need to say anything? They're just let them destroy themselves at times.
Well, there's a mixed bag on that. Ken Ham's bunch is a perfectly fine illustration. Ken Ham had a giant schism, I think it was about 2007 or 8, somewhere around in there, where he had he was regarded as too imperious with how he was controlling the purse strings at AIG. And so there was a revolt within the thing, and they had a big lawsuit and a schism, and they split up into two groups. And so there's Creation Ministries International and Answers in Genesis. And Ken Ham has retained the Answers in Genesis part, and then the Australian and European branches all turned into CMI. And so if you look at old back issues of creation articles, you'll find them at CMI, not at AIG, because they kind of divvied up the pile of stupid as to which side gets on what side on it. But this doesn't change the fact that millions of people still adhere to the dogmas, and they will cherry pick from CMI and Answers in Genesis and Kent Hovind and Intelligent Design without any care whatsoever about what kind of schisms or infighting there are.
Yeah.
Oh, Peter in the live chat says, I'll be talking to Kent Hovind again this week. We'll set up that confrontation. Yes, I'm hoping to be involved directly with Kent Hovind and Aaron Ra, and a few others apparently are slated to be involved in this discussion. Obviously, the more of us in the peanut gallery, the less time, the more proportionally time he would have as response time. So it'll be that kind of a thing. But nevertheless, yeah, I've been wanting to have an interaction again with dear old Kent. I bumped into him years ago. In the 1990s, I covered that in the Dynamania chapter. Read the Dynamania chapter at TIP. Where I discussed my interactions with him. This was way before Kent was famous. He was just a small-scale blip on the edge of the horizon in 1997. Now he's way more prominent in this area, and of course controversial and notorious because of his prison term and all that other kind of stuff. But make no mistake about it, in terms of what actual working people in the creationist community do, and the ones that have state legislatures and governors and cabinet post people who actually believe creationism stuff, they're likely to be reflecting that Kent Hovind hyperconservatism way more than the kind of collegiate button-down anti-evolutionism of Gunther Bechly. So even though it's important to go after the intelligent design movement as well, crock a squirrel, don't give up on the Kent Hovind, that Kent Hovind is an idiot nuisance that is an influential idiot nuisance. I pointed out in a lot of the stuff in TIP where there were people who were Kent Hovindistas that filtered up into the food chain. One of the people at Dover in the Kitzmiller case was a groupie of Kent Hovind videos.
I am completely familiar with the Kitzmiller case. That shit was hilarious.
Oh my! Look, Peter says it looks like it's just going to be me and Kent Hovind. Whee! It'll be one-on-one. I'll have fun. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this for. Oh, they're going to do separate shows apparently. Yeah. BJ says every time RJ says Gunther Bechly, I think Göbekli Tepe. Yeah, yeah. Well, Göbekli Tepe, yes, is a fascinating deposit of archaeological dig in Turkey. That is one of the oldest religious ceremonies. They had a kind of a bull cult. It's, if memory serves me, it's like 9,000 BC, which of course is like 3,000 years before the beginning of the Earth, according to Kent Hovind. And it's some of the earliest recognizable religious cults.
You have a math fail, because 9,000 BCE would be, about 11,000 years ago, and we're talking about 5,000 years longer than the Earth's been around, according to Bishop Usher. Whoever really
well, no, yeah, 4,004 BC, yeah, and compared to 9,000, so it's about 5,000 years early. It's double the age of the Earth in pre-Christian times, roughly. But you know, you get the Göbekli Tepe is yet another case. It pops up peripherally in some of the creationist literature. It doesn't pop up really at all in intelligent design literature because they don't give a rat's ass about any map of time issues.
Yeah.
But you got to at least give creationists props on the fact that they do bump into this stuff because they got to, because they have to shred all history and science that doesn't fit the flood model, and it's very rigid. You were about to say something, Cap.
Yeah, it was just on your going against Kent Hovind. It's I just have one thing to say: play nice. He doesn't quite have the he doesn't have the intellect you have, so you do have to realize he is a little lower at that level.
At the risk of insult, a bar of soap has more intellect than Kent Hovind.
Yeah. Well, yes, you are in fact insulting bars of soap.
Yeah, indeed. Yes. Yeah. Well, I think I have a couple of them that have been worn down to nubs on my washstand that are kind of nearing that level. So they're at about there.
There are some dead amoebas that can outthink Kent Hovind. Seriously.
Yeah. Kent's one advantage is that he's a fast sprinter. He jumps from one subject to another. But on details, of course, he has to kind of riff. And I thought in the Aaron Ra debate, it was really revealing as Aaron was knocking off technical taxa right and left. Constantly, you could just see poor Kent have to kind of back off and say, well, I don't really know anything about that. And I haven't studied that. And I haven't looked into that. You know, that's a really long area of subject matter.
Yeah. Aaron just, he knew Kent's tactics, and he's like, I ain't playing your game today. You're on my turf. We're going to talk what I want to talk on. And yeah, I'm not going to let you wiggle out of it. And that was just, I watched that about 3 or 4 times, and it's still comedy gold. Just every time I watch it.
Old Scratch says, yeah, a creationist told me Göbekli Tepe was a shrine that that would be an example of creationists trying to kind of ramrod the data field into their frame, because there's the data points don't go away, but how they're shuffleboarded around depends upon the ideology. Intelligent designers don't have to worry about booking the arc. So all of the things that are attended on chronology just don't show up on there. Gunter Bechly is never going to figure out or worry about when soulish humans came into existence, the way Hugh Ross tries to ponder. But your young Earth creationist is forced into the frame. Every single thing that existed in the past has to be before or after the flood. And that becomes a demarcation zone. So if it's a fossil data point, well, it's got to be flood event, right? So now they've got to figure out how to deal with cramming the stuff in. And my particular favorite, of course, and I deal with this a lot when I'm jousting with creationists, to see if they make the mistake of saying, oh, there are flood legends all over the world. At which point I go, not in Egypt. And suddenly they're on the defensive, because I looked into the creationist apologetics on this for that very purpose. And I've tracked it down so far, down to some 19th century apologists. There was a 19th century religious writer who cited a 18th century Frenchman on the supposed flood story that was in Egypt. It's all secondary sources. No creationist has ever offered a primary text source or an inscription source or anything like that. Literally none have ever documented any supposed Egyptian flood story. And that's because they can't. There isn't one. And so the best they can do is kind of scavenge around. One of the little creationists I was bumping into, I think it was Pablo, tried to toss off the Osiris inundation at the beginning of the world thing. But it's not a Noah flood story. And the other problem is the Egyptian chronology, because Egypt straddles the flood period. So that at the time that the flood is supposedly happening, around 2350 BC, the pyramids are being built. And they're apparently not noticing. So it's forced into it. And I've been waiting for this for years as a ticking time bomb. I've been kind of sitting back here going, creationists aren't Egyptologists. But eventually they're going to have to notice that Egypt's long chronology straddles the flood time. And they can't allow it to operate as a separate blip. They just can't simply say the Egyptians didn't notice. Or they have to deal with the fact that according to the flood, Noah landed on the ark on Mount Ararat, and then all the little kids come out, and then they start breeding like rabbits, and they eventually populate the earth again. And a bunch of them eventually then settle in where Egypt is now. And what do? Well, if you have the standard chronology, you have the Egyptians with their designs of the way their things work and the way the language works and the mythology and the gods. And then at some point, Noah's kids have come in, and where is the sign of them? There's no discontinuity. It's the same religion, the same language, the same dress styles, everything, rituals, everything remains the same. And so where is this Noah thing?
That's been my argument very typically. Where, if this flood wiped out everything on Earth, then where do you have civilizations that came into complete reversal at that particular period of time? Because
it would all be simultaneous to boot. So you theoretically could have, with all different cultures of the world, if any of them go back before the flood, you should find a discontinuity at the flood and then a replacement by children of Noah. But that's not what you find anywhere.
RJ, don't you know that the pyramids were built after the flood and all that was done after the flood from Noah's argument. Kids?
That what happened is that you find Down, I think is his name, and there's a couple other ones that have gotten on the bandwagon just in the last few years. And they are forced by the logic of flood geology to do what they're doing, which effectively is to take little rollers and put it under all of Egyptian chronology and move the whole shebang down after the flood. Not just the pyramids, the whole bit. All of Egypt has to post-date the flood so that the Egyptians are now perceived as a corruption of the sinful children of Noah that have resettled Egypt. That's the only argument that can fit. Because if they allow any of Egypt's continuity to predate the flood, they've got this continuity problem to deal with. So they're bumping into the Velikovskians and Roll, who's this revisionist Egyptologist that's trying to revise the chronology. And it always involves, here's some green eye shade stuff for you. How many have heard of the papyrus Ippaware?
Been there.
No.
Okay. Yeah. Crocker Squirrel knows about it. The Ippaware papyrus is this lament about how terrible things are. And it's dating from the Middle Kingdom, which is way earlier than the other stuff that dates from later. And the problem is that various people are so entranced by some of the superficial similarities of this to the plagues of Egypt that they want to correlate the two. And Velikovsky tried to do it. Roll uses it. Down, all of them make use of the Ippaware papyrus and pulling it down to connect up with the Exodus and the plagues of Egypt. And you're just shredding things. It's making mincemeat out of a whole bunch of chronology because it's way worse than it was even in Velikovsky's era in the 1950s. It's that you've got a vast interlocking network of communication going on. You've got archives going back and forth. You've got communications between the Egyptians and the Hittites and that now, to where if you suddenly start moving any of this, everything connected to it moves down. And it's just a morass that it'll be fun to try to see how far creationists can push this. I suspect it's always going to be a niche market because it makes Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill seem like a walk in the park, because they're just, and it's an impossible task. And the data field's just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger on this one. Well, okay, so we're past our timeline here. Sometimes we go way over and all of that. So I'll just summarize the basic gist of what I was trying to do in today's episode, which was my continual riff off of the bad methodology of Rupe and Sanford, and a counterpart argument about Beckley and his inability to think about his own model, and our little nod at the poor little schmuck who was trying to take me on the earlier Rupe episode, to where the kid just can't look up sources and won't look up sources. And so it's a continual leitmotif that source methods matter, that it's a universal toolkit that will always be a benefit to you and always be a detriment to the woo believers, because you will understand more. You will be able to play the game if you get inured to it, to where it's just second nature to you to source check. And they can't play this game ever. Their brains seize up on it because they can't deal with data that doesn't fit the model. They can't abandon things they want to be true, because the reason why they believe them to begin with is they want them to be true. So they just can't look at it. Go ahead, Croc.
No, I'm just agreeing with you. Go for it.
Yeah. So anyway, there's the dynamic of it. I'll just say Peter over in the live checks is currently using all of them as leverage to have Hovind agree to talk to Aaron Ra again. Aaron has already agreed to do so. It's apparently going to be a whole series of these things, which will be just delightful. And I will try to uphold my end of the argument. And I, of course, will be applying source methods. I'll be relying upon my familiarity with Hovind, what he has said and what he hasn't said, and try to slow him down enough on source methods questions to get him to pin him down, and hopefully we'll get some deer in the headlight look. Although often he doesn't leave his camera on. He sometimes just puts up a little blurb picture, so we may not. But I'm going to put my ugly mug up live on these things so people can see me reacting on things.
See, here's your problem. He's more likely to ignore your questions than answer them.
Well, it's apparently going to be, instead of a conventional debate, it's going to be more of a conversation. Now, I'm perfectly happy with letting him run on a lot and let him give enough rope to hang on, because for one thing, there's an advantage to Hovind, and if he's listening to this, I'm giving secrets away here, so this is the irony, is that the longer he rattles on repeating the dogmas, the more time you have to think through your response, so that you can ponder just exactly the right tactical thing to hit back with when he pauses for air and you come in with your response. So you can make use of that repetitive rambling quality that he does. And everybody that's followed Kent Hovind, if you haven't noticed by now how he repeats the same shtick, I mean, he's got a rote set of things. And in any discussion, he wants to end with an evangelical plea for conversion. That's because everything he does is a ministry. He's not there. He doesn't give a rat's ass about trilobites or dinosaurs. He wants to convert you to Jesus and save you for eternity. And that's his end game.
Yeah.
But along the way,
I was going to say, kind of in line with what Squirrel said, of where he's going to ignore your question. You can ask your question and go, oh, well, that's good, but what about this? This is, it's like, he'll try and steer the conversation away from what you asked to try and get you off topic. That's one that I noticed. And don't forget, RJ, he's after you. He's very open about that.
Oh, I hope so.
Although I'll say this, I don't know if he's your type.
I have done in no uncertain terms, and I interact. I toss things. I follow him on Twitter and various others. I don't think he's blocked me at all. Neither is Eric, for that matter. And there's another one that would be kind of fun to deal with. Pelogi, of course, has done stuff there, but the Peter says that so far Hovind has said he won't go in the non sequitur show again, so fingers crossed. Well, there may have been an example that there were several episodes of non sequitur where he had some really stiff competition. He had the Lord Crocoduck, who's a physicist, go after him, and then and Jim, what's his last name? Not Hudlow, but what Jim? Can't think of it. It starts with an H. The anthropologist.
He's King not Lord Crocoduck. Thank you.
And King Crocoduck. At any rate, both of them were very formidable and knew their stuff. The one guy, Jim, was very up on his game because he'd followed a lot of Kent's lectures, and so he knew his shtick. He already had preparations done, PowerPoint slides ready to go to respond to it, because that you can take advantage of the fact that Hovind is very repetitive. He's not a source
Yeah.
claimant. He's never been a source claimant.
I still have to say my favorite interaction, besides the Aaron Ra one, was probably him and Bill Ludlow. That was a good one.
Yeah, Bill Ludlow. There we go. Yeah. Bill was very much on his game.
Yeah.
He knows and loves his material, and he made a point of dealing with the arguments that Hovind has made. I think a lot of people that get involved in these debates may be knowledgeable at the data floor, but if they're not closely familiar with the apologetic style of their opponents, they're going to miss opportunities for response. Because you needed to, Kent Hovind is a different kind of apologist than a Ray Comfort, who's different than a Steve Meyer, who's different than a Gunther Bechly. And so they all have their own Achilles heels. They all have their own axes to grind. They have their own cultural frames, and you have different ammunition that you would deploy. One thing that I'll want to bring up with Hovind is the fact that he is regarded as a doofus by Answers in Genesis. He's regarded as scripturally unreliable and factually unreliable. And how bad do you have to be regarded as such by Answers in Genesis?
Yeah, it's not.
I've called Kent Hovind. Well, let me put it the reverse way. I've called Donald Trump the Kent Hovind of American politics, and it works the other direction. That Kent Hovind is the Donald Trump of creationism. Is somebody that's so off the wall, so incompetent that anybody that takes him seriously can't take him seriously. They're just completely off the reservation, to borrow a politically incorrect cliche. And so Hovind, it'll be fun to deal with, and I'll hope to equip myself well, and I will be probing constantly from a source methods direction, which is not merely what his claims are, but why does he think they're true? On what basis did he determine they were true? And also to probe, I'm going to try to bring up the reptile-mammal transition, which Kent has never written anything on. He's never lectured anything on it. It doesn't come up in his discussions, in part because he's a secondary redactor, and there's very little on this online that he would have ever bumped into. So it's understandable that it didn't pop up in his apologetics. He'd be up at sea. What, is he going to Google on the fly to find out about the reptile-mammal transition?
Oh, good.
Well, if he tried to do that, he'd wind up at tip.
Yeah.
Well, no, I know exactly what he could find online, because remember, I wrote the damn book on it. So you've got John Woodmarapp, you've got one of Gish's articles from 1981, you've got Doyle, and you've got some of Elizabeth Mitchell's postings. You've got a little bit of David Capage. You've got Truth in Science, which is that British creationist bunch, and that's it. All the intelligent design material doesn't help because all of it's in book form. Both of the Denton books, Evolution, Explore Evolution, Design on Trial, or I mean, Design of Life, and the Philip Johnson stuff, that's all books. Virtually nothing in intelligent design literature online at Evolution News and Views. Since I follow them assiduously, I know these. So if you're an online Googler on the reptile-mammal transition, there's a very limited data set. And remember, I covered all of it in Slam Dunk. So I'll put in, as I close off here, Evolution Slam Dunk, damn it. If you don't have my book, please get my book, and you won't be disappointed. And plus, RJ will get the royalties, and that'll make me more of a happy camper. So thank you very much, Cap and Crocker Squirrel, for acting as peanut gallery today.
Yeah.
And
thanks for the invite.
We'll be continuing to do the show for next week. It'll be a long time for me to slog through Contested Bones. As you can see on here, I'm only about just a tiny sliver of the way through the thing. But a source methods analysis is time-consuming, but instructive, I think. You learn so much doing it. Because some cases I'm encountering that he's cited sources I already was aware of, but I'm occasionally encountering peripheral material, particularly older technical papers. So often they were riffing off of stuff in the 1980s and 70s and that, which I really hadn't paid attention to because I was paying attention to the modern technical literature. So you learn more and more about the field, and that means your own argument gets stronger and theirs gets weaker because now you know where they're tripping up. So it's the ultimate toolkit. And the more I can get people onto it, if everybody pick an area that they love and follow that up. You don't have to be a universalist. I'm a universalist in that I want to attack every possible thing that every anti-evolutionist has ever done and gather it all together into the super data set. And that's what I effectively do for a living. When I'm through with this show, I'll be resuming my work, plugging in. Boy, the last week was just a killer because I had gone through a bunch of things for several creationist papers on dating systems and volcanic things, Snelling and Woodmer and that they had done back in the 90s. And there were hundreds of sources involved in that, and tracking down all the background and side material and all of that and getting it all plugged in. And I've still got probably another day or two to get it all plugged into the bibliography on that. But that means that's more of the data field that I've gotten pinned down. And it means that gradually I can eventually reach the stage, hint, hint, when I got enough money to constantly print stuff up without having to put them in temp files. I want to be able to get my backlog out to the point where all of that stuff is entered printing level. So there's another thing where, crowd, come on and help the GoFundMe. I know you're out there. Okay, well, thank you very much for watching this episode. And we're going to plug away at it as long as we can. And it's the good fight. And everybody embrace source methods analysis and keep good sense of humor. Use wit and style and know your data field. And that's the way you can oppose wooists without ever calling them liars and without ever being rude or annoying. You can be as polite and sweet as Jackson Wheat and end up shredding them just as effectively as any shark. Okay. Bye, kids.